Hello and welcome to Anti-Sceptic. I'm Kelsey De Almeida, stand-up comedian, Christian, and now podcaster. In this show, we'll be discussing all the interesting and sometimes slightly weird things people believe in, from religion and vegan diets to asking the big questions like, can we really contact the dead? Join me where in each episode I'll be chatting to an expert or a funny guest discussing a belief that's close to their heart. So, let's introduce today's guest. Today on the show, I talk to Dr Emily Grossman. Dr Emily is an expert in molecular biology and genetics, with a double first in natural sciences from Queen's College, Cambridge, and a PhD in cancer research. She was also recently named the second Honorary STEM Ambassador, alongside astronaut Tim Peake, for her work in STEM education. In this episode, we talk about how you shouldn't limit yourself to just being either an artist or a scientist, and we discuss egg freezing, what that is, and why you might want to think about doing it. I also just want to say sorry for the poor sound quality in this episode. It appears whilst I was worrying about sounding smart enough to talk to someone with a double first from Cambridge, I clearly wasn't smart enough to think about doing a sound check beforehand, so enjoy my crisp voice in this bit at least. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Podcorn for sponsoring this episode. Podcorn is a marketplace that connects podcasters like me to brilliant sponsorship opportunities such as host read ads, interview segments, topical discussions, and more. With Podcorn, there's no middleman. Podcasters of all sizes can search and choose opportunities on the platform, set their own rates, and collaborate with brands directly without any exclusivities. You never give up any rights to your podcast, and Podcorn is there to support you at every step and ensure you're protected and compensated for the work that you do for brands. The marketplace mission is to give podcasters transparency, creative freedom, and full control of how and when we monetize. There's a link in my show notes to sign up to Podcorn and start browsing sponsorship opportunities. Now it's time to welcome my guest for this episode, Dr. Emily Grossman. Dr. Emily, hi and welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. Now, I already started off by calling you Dr. Emily, and I've been thinking about how I was going to talk to you, how I was going to introduce you, Dr. Grossman, Dr. Emily. Is it just Emily? Like, what do you prefer? What vibe do you go with?
It always amuses me when people call me Dr. Emily because that's my sort of character, I guess, in the books that I write for kids, and when I do talks or shows in schools or online now for schools, the kids always refer to me as Dr. Emily. So you're very welcome to call me Dr. Emily, but equally Emily will suffice.
Do you know, because it's been so long since I've spoken to someone and used like a title before their name. The last time must have been school, like, you know, in assembly we go, good morning, Mrs. Jackson.
Yeah, you probably didn't call them Doctor then first name. You probably called them Doctor second name. So I think, you know, Doctor first name is quite an interesting one.
That is true. It's nice of you to say, like, I'll probably stick to calling you Dr. Emily just because I just feel more comfortable probably with that. But thing is, I was thinking about this and I would have no such modesty in telling people, oh, call me whatever you want. It's like the people that get knighted and they go, oh, don't call me sir. I'm like, you worked hard for it. Like, use it to the max because I don't know. I don't know. I'd even get my kids to be like, you know, Dr. Dad, Dr. Kelsey. And I'm like, yes, sweetheart.
Well, that's true, actually. Yeah, when I finished my PhD, I mean, that was so hard won. It was such a slog, and it was probably one of the most difficult things I've done in my whole life. And the moment that doctorate came through and I passed my Viva, I was straight on the phone to my bank and I was like, put doctor in front of my name, please. Send me some new bank cards. So my friends all laughed at me that, you know, pretty almost immediately I was kind of like Dr. Emily Grossman on all my sort of official bank statements, and I was going to get changed for everything, you know, my TV license and my utility bills, because I was just so, you know, it was less that I was proud, and it was more that I was just like, I worked so hard for this that the world is going to know.
Does it ever come in handy in like arguments? Because I imagine it would if your partner turns around and says something like, look, you're just being unreasonable, Emily, and you're like, that's Dr. Emily to you.
No, it's actually quite the opposite, because when we're sort of bickering or we're having a sort of, let's say, difference of views on something, he'll playfully refer to me as Dr. Emily, and then I'll just fall about laughing, or I'll just give him a hug, because I just find it really sweet, because it really makes me, when I'm called Dr. Emily, it just really sort of disarms me, because it just feels really affectionate and warm. And it's kind of how, I have a lot of primary school kids who I work with and who read my books who sort of say, oh, Dr. Emily, can you tell me this? And it always just makes me smile.
It's almost nice. It almost maybe disarms an argument and just reminds you, aren't we just being
Exactly.
silly? That
Exactly.
kind of thing.
Because Dr. Emily's character, Dr. Emily is very much like me, but she's very much an aspect of me. She's the me that's kind of, I'm 42 years old, but she's the me that's sort of ever 5 years old and curious and excited about the world, even within my 42-year-old body and brain and way that I articulate myself. That 5-year-old who went on car journeys with my dad and who got told exciting stories about the world and got really fascinated with asking questions and wanting to know things. And, there is that part of me that is still that curious child that is just so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and full of wonder, that actually that's the part of me that it really speaks to. And that's the part of me that's, one of the parts of myself that I actually love the most and that I enjoy bringing out to play, shall we say.
And actually, speaking of sort of like your inner child and stuff, I read that you actually grew up or sort of trained as to be an actress. You wanted to be an actor.
I did.
Before science sort of kicked in.
Yeah, no, it was actually the other way around in terms of my sort of formal training. But in terms of the interest and the passion, they really involved side by side, which evolved, I mean to say, side by side, because, there's this sort of old-fashioned idea that at school you're sort of supposed to be into one thing, or you've got one passion or one vocation that you want to be when you grow up, which of course is complete nonsense. Studies show that these days, particularly young people, by the time they're 30, will have had at least 10 different careers, if not more. And a lot of those careers don't even exist yet. So, they're not even things that we can even dare to dream up right now. But for me, right from as young as I can remember, I had really two main passions. And one was science, finding out about the world, understanding the world, doing maths problems. I really loved kind of analysis and logic and wonderment of the world. But the other part of me really loved performance. So I remember dancing around my living room, aged 4 years old, kind of my mum putting on music and just kind of expressing myself to music. I loved singing. And that part of me really wanted to be an actress. So when people used to ask me that annoying question when you're a kid, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'd be like, okay, well, easy. I want to be a scientist and I want to be an actress. And they'd look at me with this sort of slightly, weary look on their face and say, oh, come on, Emily, you can't be both. You've got to choose. And I'd be like, well, no, I don't want to have to choose. So I did end up obviously having to choose in terms of on paper what I went off to study at university, and the subjects I studied at school to some extent, although I did keep my options open as much as I could. So I did study music and I did study art, but I went on to specialise in the sciences and in maths, because the advice that I got, which was actually very wise advice from the adults around me, was, in terms of study, go down the academic route first. In my case, that was science, because that was something they said would be harder to come back to later in life if I decided to change path, which indeed I did, but the other way around. So they reassured me to keep up my science and my singing, my theatre, my singing, dancing, absolutely not to sort of drop it or let it go, but to keep that on the side as a sort of hobby whilst I pursued the science, and then to see where it took me, which is exactly what I ended up doing. I did sciences and maths at A-level. I studied natural sciences at Cambridge University. And then I went on to do a PhD in cancer research, or molecular biology, really, at the University of Manchester. But all through that time, all the way through school, all the way through my two university experiences, every time I had a spare moment, I was off out rehearsing for a musical, or singing in a choir, or singing jazz standards in a local restaurant, or joining a band, or doing everything I could around performance, such that my time at Cambridge, actually, I joined the University Musical Theatre Society, and I think in my first year, I was studying natural sciences, but I was also in I think over the course of the 3 years, I think I counted up, I was in 9 plays and musicals. I think all musicals, actually. So, I was really passionately into singing and dancing. Actually, I was pretty hopeless at dancing, but I was certainly into singing and acting. I enjoyed dancing, don't get me wrong, but I couldn't follow steps to save my life. But such that when I actually eventually did finish my PhD, I did decide to sort of switch things around for a while and pursue my love of musical theatre in terms of training. So the same week as I got awarded my PhD, as I got my viva, I actually received my letter to say that I'd been accepted to study a postgraduate diploma in musical theatre at Guildford School of Acting. So it was super exciting. So I then went off into a career in musical theatre. Having spent a year training, I spent 8 years working on and off as much as I was able to as a professional singer and actress. And then this time sort of kept the science on in the side. So sort of by doing in between acting jobs, I made my living as a tutor, teaching maths and science to young people, and then actually working also part-time in a couple of schools teaching science and maths where I could. And then after those two careers, I then spent some time, which I guess we can come back to, I spent some time sort of in a bit of a crisis actually, having for various reasons, and then it ended up in my sort of third career, I suppose, or fourth if you count teaching, which is what I do now as a science communicator, which is really for me bringing together all the different aspects of myself and all the different aspects of my passions and my skills in terms of the science side, but also the teaching side and also the performance and communication side. So I've finally found a sort of place for myself which sort of fulfills all the different parts of myself all in one place.
This is so fascinating because usually as a child you can kind of put them into two camps, sort of the maths and the science or the arts and crafts, but you seem to have this life where you had the best of both worlds, and I kind of like the idea of you doing both at the same time, maybe in a lab and someone coming up to you going, hey, did I see you in Macbeth last year?
Yeah, it kind of was like that, but I want to just stop you there for a moment because you're right in the sense that on paper, studying maths and science is a bit different to studying arts and crafts or music. But actually, I want to really just see if we can kind of challenge that idea that they are that different. Because, if we do put them in those boxes in that way, then we would be tempted to actually categorize somebody who does maths and science as a particular type of person. So, let me put that to you, Kelsey. Like, if I was to say to you, draw a picture of a scientist and just knee-jerk reaction without thinking about it, what would you draw?
I draw a sort of older woman in a lab coat.
You draw a woman. Amazing. This is just such music to my ears. Most people, believe it or not, still, even in this day and age, if they were asked, if these studies have been done, if you go out to the streets and you say to someone, draw a scientist, most people would draw a man, well, an old white man. So this characteristic, this caricature of a scientist, for a lot of people out there, whether you actually consciously really believe this or not, the caricature is still an old white man. So male, white, old, and more potently, because of course this isn't true, this is complete nonsense that this is what a scientist is like. I mean, I'm a scientist, and there's plenty of completely phenomenally successful and brilliant and inspiring female role models in science. Of course, many people of color, many people of not just female but also different genders, maybe non-binary or transgender, but also people who are of different ages and of different backgrounds. But what's also really important is that when, and you'll see in a moment how this comes back to the sort of categorization of art versus science, but what's also really important is that generally if you ask people to describe a scientist, not just what they look like, but what kind of personality that person might have. I mean, let me ask you, Kelsey, what sort of personality do you think a typical scientist might have? The cliche, the stereotype.
Sort of very bookish,
yeah,
not very sporty, not very adventurous, maybe an introvert, that sort of thing.
And what about their sort of sensitivities? Do you think they would be emotional, this sort of cliched image of a scientist?
I guess just like a regular person.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's tricky because you of all people, are one who is out there, challenging stereotypes. But when I ask people this question, and again, it's not just myself, but other people have done surveys on this. Generally, what people come back with is somebody who, exactly as you said, is nerdish, is bookish. Other words are boring, dry, geeky, unemotional, logical, cold. All of these cliches, which are just a complete nonsense. And you can see where it comes from, because archetypally you had the sort of Einstein characteristic, and you've got the image of the scientist working alone in their laboratory. But that is just not true, but also it's been perpetuated by movies and by TV series, and even sometimes by science textbooks, which are all now changing, but not fast enough. You've got the sort of, if you're my age, you've got the kind of Doc Brown from Back to the Future, or Ross in Friends, or the scientist from Jurassic Park. But also, these days there are changing role models, but you've still got this kind of, a lot of people still have this idea of the sort of boring old white man. And the problem is that it's not just not true, But that actually perpetuates this idea that arts and sciences are not just different subjects, but they attract different types of people. And in fact, not just attract, but that different types of people would be happy and successful in those careers. And in fact, when you ask young people, particularly young girls, sort of teenage girls or early teenage girls, whether they want to study maths and science subjects or indeed why they don't want to, the most common reason that's given is not that they're not good enough, because actually girls routinely outperform boys actually in maths and science subjects, but that's by the by. But it's not that they're not good enough. It's not even they don't enjoy it, because actually a lot of young people really love science subjects, but it's that they think that it's just not for someone like them. And that's this idea that, oh, I'm just a bit too to be a scientist. I'm a bit too sensitive. I'm a bit too emotional. I'm a bit too sporty, as you said. I'm a bit too artistic. I'm a bit too into music. And that this idea is just, it's still embedded in people's psyches, that there is a person who does art and music or sport, a type of person, and there is a type of person who does maths and science. And I think this is not only wrong, but it's incredibly damaging, because even the fact you say, oh gosh, it's really interesting that you did science and you did music and singing and dancing. And I'd say, well, those are really, it's one person who enjoys both, because actually, for me, this comes back to what I call the 3 C's, because science for me is not just about logic and analysis and solving problems and asking questions and being curious about the world, which of course is very important, but it's also about compassion, collaboration, and creativity. And all 3 of those qualities, characteristics, are really important in terms of having a passion and an interest and skills in science, and show us that the sorts of person who might be into maths and science is absolutely the sort of person who also might be into music and theatre and sport or arts and crafts, because science is very much also about compassion. So that's caring deeply about the world, about helping the world, about saving the planet, helping cure diseases or helping invent important equipment, or in terms of engineering. So, it's important to be a very caring and compassionate person. You don't have to be, but those qualities can be very useful. Science is about collaboration. So that's in terms of science being very much teamwork. Some people work alone as a scientist, but a lot of people as scientists and engineers and working in technology, it's a very team-driven sort of profession. So it's very important to be able to work with others, to be able to share your ideas, to be able to be open to the thoughts and feelings and sensitivities of other people, so you can work well as a team. And the third C, and this is the sort of framing that I used in my TEDx talk, actually, which is called Why Science Needs People Who Cry. And in that framing, the third C is creativity. And of course, we all know that science is creative, but perhaps we sort of forget sometimes when we think, well, actually, in order to be a scientist, it really helps if you're really imaginative, if you're sensitive to the world around you, and able to kind of look at things differently, able to kind of come to problems with new approaches, able to try stuff out, that you're open to getting things wrong and having a go and trying again and doing things really in sort of new and exciting and different ways. So actually, all of those qualities are exactly the same as the qualities that I take into the performance side of my career or the artistic part of my career. So sorry, that was a long diversion, but I just wanted to sort of knock that on the head, really.
I'm glad you did. I'd never really thought of it like that. I mean, whilst you was talking, I was trying to work out in myself, thinking, well, why did I think that? And it's probably a little bit of a resentment, because I've put all my eggs in the kind of arts and crafts basket, and that's bit me right in the bum, considering I haven't worked since March. Society is quite happy to go on without my career getting a second seeing to. So I'd never even thought of it, that, you can have both the creative part of you and also, and it's funny you said about the emotional thing. I think in science, I'd never really thought about it, but I've had so many examples of people, like, for example, I have a friend of mine who was a paramedic for 30 years. And I said to him, how does it not affect you? Like, how do you not come home? And he just says, well, once I go to work, I just have a different brain. I just switch into a different frame of mind. And then when he comes home, he has to sort of become a different person, almost like you were saying about playing a character. So I never kind of thought about emotion ever taking a play in it, because it's sort of like, in the sort of way cabin crew on a plane, are trained in the case of an emergency, whereas I'm not.
Absolutely.
So we're going to have
Yeah.
very different emotional responses.
Absolutely. I think that's a really crucial point you bring up, because of course there is a time and place for emotion, and there's a time and place for, becoming a character, playing a role. And, it's interesting you bring up cabin crew, because that's the example that I've been most trolled about, really. Is sort of, I did a lot of using my platform to talk about how important it is to be sensitive and emotional. And people would say, well, if you're a pilot, you don't want to burst into tears in the cockpit, and you said cabin crew. It's like, absolutely, of course not. There's a time and a place for it. But that doesn't mean that you can't go home and be emotional, and then use what you've learned through your emotional engagement to, maybe you've had a bumpy ride, so to speak, or there's been sort of a bit of a scare, and you can express that emotion and use it to work out how you could have done differently next time. And similarly, in the case of paramedics, absolutely, paramedics need to be trained to be able to be rational and think clearly. But that doesn't mean that they don't have sensitivity. That doesn't mean they don't use, surely it takes compassion to want to be a paramedic in the first place, but it's about knowing when it's appropriate to bring that forward, and when it's appropriate to go home. And actually, I would imagine if a paramedic goes home, I obviously don't know this. A lot of my family are doctors, but none of them are paramedics. But I would imagine that if a paramedic doesn't come home and to some extent connect with that emotion of the experience that they've had, of perhaps any fear that they felt, or any grief, or any pain, or any sort of compassion or empathy, that it's important to have an outlet to express that. And there's been a lot of studies that have shown that mental health is very much linked to our ability, or our permission, because everyone has the ability, our permission that society gives us, or that we give ourselves, to express our emotions. Because expressing our emotions, mental health professionals agree, is one of the best ways that we can actually process what's happened to us in the world. So bottling up our feelings and stuffing them downwards and turning them inwards just leads to stress and anxiety and depression. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't choose when to express them, for sure, but allowing ourselves to express them, to let them come out, is the best way to give them sort of their just desserts, shall I say, to give them some attention, to let them be there, to let them pass through us, and then we feel better afterwards. And in fact, studies show that 9 out of 10 people feel better after a good cry. And I would challenge a lot of people listening to say, actually, of course it's different. There are types of crying, there are situations when that isn't always the best thing to do in that moment. But actually allowing ourselves, and allowing the people in our lives, allowing people around us to be able to express ourselves, I think actually leads us to be much more authentic, open, relaxed, and fully rounded human beings. And studies have actually shown that in order to be our creative selves, which is of course something that's required, as I've said, for science just as much as it's required for art and crafts and sport, to allow us to be fully creative, our brain has to actually oscillate between periods of intense focus, of course, but also intense relaxation, where we can just completely let everything go and just sort of switch off entirely, get to a sort of Zen place, I suppose, and then we allow the creative life force to come through. And I would argue, and a lot of mental health professionals argue the same, is that we can't fully relax unless we're actually allowing ourselves to process and express any emotions that have come to us during the day or during our work life just as much as our personal life. So for me, it's all about saying, yes, this is a time when actually, no, we're in a board meeting and we need to be, to some extent a character. But actually, even then, I would argue that sometimes to be expressed vulnerability, you might not want to cry, but, what if you did? What if you showed your workmates or your colleagues or whatever in a meeting or at an event that actually something was affecting you, that you felt vulnerable and that you then moved on from it and got some support. So I'm just saying that there's sort of grey areas around this, which often we don't explore in society, because society is so sort of hell-bent on making us have a stiff upper lip and show that we're in control and that everything's okay, which I think is particularly damaging. There's an expression that says bullets are unshed tears. And I think there's no time more appropriate to kind of really think about and feel about what that actually means in today's society than right now and what's going on in the world.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think the idea for someone to say that, science shouldn't be mixed with emotion and that could jeopardize your work, or science should be, like you said, having a stiff upper lip, it would make no sense, because then you could argue that no revolutionary scientific discoveries or inventions would ever be created, which actually brings me on to something I wanted to talk to you about, which you've sort of been very outspoken in sort of campaigning for, is egg freezing, for women to freeze their eggs maybe in their sort of 20s or their 30s for future use, because there's a certain time frame that women have because of, is it the amount of eggs that women can produce and stuff? So you could say, if there was no emotion in science, no one would have ever invented that, because people would have been like, well, just get on with it, rather than go, no, actually, let's try and create a solution so that people can make a decision in the future for when they want to actually decide sensibly when they want to have children, rather than rush into it.
Exactly. Scientific discovery is about compassion and caring about how everybody feels and experiences the world, and it's about sensitivity to the needs and the challenges that face many people, not just women, on the planet today. So yes, social egg freezing, so egg freezing for personal use or egg freezing for reasons other than medical infertility, through cancer treatment, for example, is becoming increasingly more talked about. And it's something that I feel very passionately about. It's something that I've undergone myself. And it's something that I think should really be talked about more in terms of raising awareness and in terms of moving past the stigma and the sort of taboo around talking about fertility at all for women.
And you said you've done it yourself. And obviously, you being a scientist yourself, you obviously know better than most what you're sort of getting yourself into. Would you mind sort of explaining the process of what makes you decide to get up one day and go, I'm going to have this done? Because I sort of imagine dating a scientist with that sort of knowledge might be strange, asking how would you like your eggs in the morning, frozen in a lab for future usage. I was thinking more like scrambled. So what was it that sort of came to you and went, do you know what? This is what I want to do?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And so my story really was that I sort of growing up, I'd always felt, having kids is the sort of the thing to do as a woman. I have to say I didn't have a huge maternal instinct, but I also felt quite strongly that this was something that was really important to me and that I might like to do one day. So I wasn't sort of driven in my 20s, as some of my friends were, to have babies, but equally it was, I thought very much that my future would involve, getting married and having kids, And I had a series of long-term relationships. None of them led to that sort of commitment that would lead to having a family. And certainly not something I was avoiding, but I also was having a great time in my career. My career was going really well. And I got to the age of sort of my mid-30s, and I really started to sort of feel that sort of concern, that sort of extra, that growing biological drive, biological pressure to have a child. And I wasn't at the time in a relationship where I wanted to do that. So it was sort of in the back of my mind. And then at around the same time, I attended a talk at the Cheltenham Science Festival in the UK, and it was called the Fertility Time Bomb. And I was just quite intrigued by the title, so I went along. And it was a couple of fertility experts who were basically saying, in no uncertain terms, that it was really important for women to understand that the fertility rates really decrease very rapidly from the age of 35. So not fertility rates, pregnancy rates, or basically fertility. So what they explained was that fertility drops by about half between the age of 35 to 40, and half again, this is just in women, between 40 to 42. And I was just completely blown away, because I had no idea that the drop-off was this extreme or this fast.
Yeah, wow.
I was reassured by the fact that I was at the time about 35, and I was reassured that it hadn't started to drop quite yet. But it's certainly, and that's an important point to make, because the advice is that if you are considering freezing your eggs, that the time to start considering it is the age of 35, that it actually doesn't really make any sense to do it before then. But with this information, and not only that, they also said that the rates of miscarriage rise rapidly, certainly from the age of sort of late 30s and 40s, and the rates of genetic abnormalities, so having a genetically different child. So I was sort of really quite horrified, and this kind of filled me with this sort of feeling of anxiety and this feeling of pressure, such that when I was in a longer term relationship, which actually sadly came to an end when I was around 38. And I came out of that relationship, I just thought, my gosh, I do feel that hopefully I would like to have a child one day. And I was sort of really stuck between two camps, because I was seeing women of my age sort of blinded by this biological urge to procreate, rushing into relationships pretty much, too fast, really, rushing into commitment too fast, rushing into having a baby with someone they barely, only just met, really, or barely knew. Sometimes that going fine, but often ending up as a single parent, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not something that I personally would have wanted to do. But on the other side of the coin, I was seeing women who were a little older than me, good friends who were a bit older than me, who had not sort of rushed into things, and who were finally, met the love of their life and found their soulmate and their partner they wanted to be with in their early 40s, and were finally kind of saying, yes, this is right, this is someone I want to have a child with, and then actually struggling to get pregnant, so much so that I was aware of some women who were ending up not being able to have a child at all naturally. Or even through IVF, because they'd left it so late. And I was just seeing the devastation and the grief that caused. So I was sort of stuck between these two worlds of going, well, I don't want to rush into it. Nobody wants to be that woman on a first date, desperately seeking a baby father. It's kind of patently obvious when that comes across on the first date. I've been there, and I know other women my age who've been there, who kind of like interviewing that first date, partner, whether you're dating a man or even whether you're dating a woman or someone in between, because you're basically saying, can you be a co-parent to my child? Is it going to be you? Are you someone that's going to be able to support me financially, or help me support myself financially? Are you someone who's going to be able to be there?
How easily do you bruise?
Well, exactly. You don't want to be that person, but equally I didn't want to put it off. So in that sort of state of pressure and disarray, I was really losing sleep over this topic. I can't put this strongly enough. It was dominating my every thought for a good few years of like, what do I do? And everything I did was like, well, if I go to this place, maybe I'll meet my partner there. Or if it was so distracting. So I decided at that point, well, I'd read about egg freezing, and they'd mentioned it in this talk I'd been to. And I started to do some research into it. And as a scientist myself, and as someone who knows how to sort of research information and what studies to believe, which is, very hard to do for a non-scientist these days, because there's so much misinformation and fake news and misinterpreted stuff out there, even if you ignore all the absolute sort of nonsense fake stuff. So, I was able to sort of find the truth, really, because there had been a lot of stuff published in newspapers saying that the success rates were really, really low. And that certainly was the case, maybe sort of 10, 15 years ago. But actually, the techniques that scientists use to freeze eggs have really changed. And actually, what I found was that the success rates are far higher than most people realised for egg freezing. They're around the same level as they are for IVF, which of course is something that, a lot of women are now pursuing and are doing and have been doing for a long time in order to have a baby at a either later age, or if they're less fertile. So what we're talking for a 35-year-old woman, we're talking success rates of about 40% for one cycle of frozen eggs. So that's kind of one egg freezing cycle, which takes a few weeks. Similar to an IVF cycle, which is basically they stimulate your ovaries to, instead of just mature one egg each month, to mature up to sort of 15 to 20 eggs within your follicles. Now, this isn't using eggs that would otherwise be used later on. This is really important. It's not depleting any natural reserves. It's simply, rather than one egg maturing and the other sort of 15 to 20 just kind of dying and sort of decaying away, it's allowing all of those possible eggs that month to mature, and then they are pulled out of you by a medical procedure. And then those eggs are put into storage, into liquid nitrogen to be frozen, rather than put into a test tube to be fertilized, which is what they would do with IVF. So it's pretty much identical process. And the success rates, like I said, so for one cycle that I've just described, it's about a 40% success rate to go through to using those eggs to have a live, healthy child at the end of it. So, that's pretty good odds for one cycle. And what they recommend is to do 3 cycles. So that's not exactly 3 times 40, but it's, it gets close to, you can never get 100%, but you're getting closer to sort of 80, 90% success rates, which to me is pretty good odds. Now, of course, the success rates do decline as you get more towards your late 30s, early 40s. By the time I did it, so I was 38 when I did my first cycle, I actually ended up doing 4 cycles. And by the time I did it at 38, the success rates probably had fallen to about 25% per cycle, and falling more like kind of 20 to 22% by the time I was in my early 40s. So, with my 4 rounds of eggs, I absolutely have no illusions to the fact that I'm guaranteed to be able to have a healthy child at the end of it if I decide, or when I decide to use those eggs. But the point is that it has just alleviated so much stress and anxiety and pressure to kind of absolutely needing to make that choice right now, absolutely needing to find the right partner right now. And it's meant that I have a sense that, if and when I do decide to have a child, that I've got a pretty good chance of being able to do that naturally, or as naturally as it can be, using eggs that have been frozen, but, using my own eggs and using my own body. And what's amazing about it is that these stored eggs, once they're removed from a woman's body, and they're removed from me at the age of 38, my eggs remain freeze frame, frozen in time at the health that they were when I was 38. So no matter how long they're frozen for, if and when they're put back into me, it doesn't matter how much my body has aged, and it doesn't matter how much my womb has aged. My womb is just a wall of muscle. Actually, those eggs will stay at the health, at the viability, at the fertility that they were when they were taken out of my body. The only caveat, the only problem, as I see it, is, well, of course, I'll come back to this. Yes, it is expensive, and that is absolutely something that is, must be taken very seriously, in the sense that I feel that I am in a very privileged position to have been able to save up and afford to do it. And an average round of egg freezing in the UK is about £3,000 to £4,000 on average, and it can vary wildly. And some people go abroad. I had considered doing it in Greece, where it was a little bit cheaper, but I decided to stay local in the end. So there is the expense. There is but then, of course, if you think of IVF can be significantly more expensive. And a lot of women go ahead and do that because, they feel, understandably, that that's worth it, for the possibility of having a child. There's also the impact on the body. So it's not a sort of just walk in the park, easy thing to go through, but actually, personally, I found that it was, very bearable and easy, and far outweighed the stress and anxiety hanging over me of not doing it. So the procedure itself involves injecting hormones, in my case, into my belly every night for about 10 days. The hormones made me feel a bit sleepy, actually made me feel quite happy a lot of the time, which is, I think, quite unusual. Some people feel a bit grumpy, a bit sort of tearful and emotional, a bit like having, a bad period, sort of PMT. And then at the end of the 10 days, there's a small medical procedure where you can be either sort of actually fully asleep, sort of, it's called a sedation, or you can be awake, but just with a local anaesthetic, where they remove the eggs from your ovaries and put them in the freezer. And then sometimes you can feel a bit grotty for a few days or up to a couple of weeks afterwards. And of course, there are risks, but they're very minimal. Risks of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, for example, but they're pretty low. But for me, aside from the impact on the woman doing it, the biggest challenge that I think there is around this procedure is raising awareness and women feeling actually empowered to be able to make that choice, and empowered to be able to talk about this openly, to even to acknowledge that they've got to, their late 30s and maybe haven't had a child, that's not your fault. It's no shame in it. There's no shame in, for whatever reason you haven't had a child, whether it's because you're focusing on your career, whether it's because you haven't found the right partner. Although I would advise that actually, if it is a choice between sort of focusing on your career and leaving it later and later, there is no replacement for having a child naturally. Egg freezing shouldn't be used by employers, certainly, to tell women to put off having children here. We'll pay for you to freeze your eggs, just don't have a child yet. And it's like that. There's no replacement.
Never thought of it like that.
But no, there has been quite some discussion about that in terms of whether employers might start offering egg freezing as a sort of bonus. And I personally I'm very mixed about that idea, because on the one hand, it's great that we're having these conversations. It's great that it's being seen as something normal and natural to do. Obviously, it's not natural, but normal and natural to have that option available. Just like, you go into hospital and you've got a broken leg and they put a cast on you. That's a medical procedure, but it helps us to look after our body. And that this is just as sort of, that there shouldn't be a stigma about it. But there is also the concern that that employers would then use that to say, well, we want you to stay in this position for a bit more time because you don't have to have a child yet because we've frozen your eggs or something. But the biggest issue surrounding it is the fact that at the moment there is an arbitrary time limit set on how long those frozen eggs can be kept for. So for medical egg freezing, so egg freezing for those who've become infertile or are going to become infertile through, for example, cancer treatment, the eggs can be kept for decades, and there is no reason why that isn't perfectly safe. There's no reason why those eggs would get less healthy, less viable, or why they should be destroyed. However, at the moment, for social egg freezing, for women who choose to do it, there is an arbitrary 10-year time limit set on those eggs. And after those 10 years, those eggs are arbitrarily destroyed. And that is, I think, an absolute travesty. And it's part of the reason why I've been speaking so publicly about this issue, because there are campaigns going on that you can join that are called Extend the Limit, that are campaigning for this arbitrary time limit to be changed. Because firstly, I don't want to get to the age of 48 and suddenly be told, well, you need to have your eggs destroyed. Surely it's up to me if I feel still young enough, energized enough, emotionally ready and able to have a child, even though perhaps some people might say, oh, well, you don't want to be old at the school gates. And it's like, well, that's my choice. And my body can certainly still have a child at that age. But more importantly, if we're only allowing eggs to be frozen for 10 years, by definition, that is then sort of pushing women to choose to freeze their eggs later. And actually, if you freeze your eggs later, you're less likely for those eggs to be healthy in the first place and fertile in the first place. So really, to me, it makes absolutely no sense and is actually quite damaging to the possibilities of this process being used in the right way by the right people at the right time.
Yeah, how interesting. There's so many issues that come with this that I never even thought of. And can I just say, as someone that had no idea that this science even existed, it sort of blows my mind that we can even do this. Like, it just seems so science fiction to me. And I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more on how we are able to actually freeze an egg that contains human life, if that makes sense. Because, like I said, I just didn't know that we could do that. If we could do that, why can't a 25-year-old just freeze his entire self? Like, why? Because that's what it feels like. You're just freezing a human life. I mean, it'd be a bit awkward to date. I mean, it sort of doesn't get past that whole dating issue, because if you're frozen in a block of ice, he was very blue. Oh, was he crude? No, he was actually just very blue. So what is it? How does that actually work? How is it that science is available?
Well, yeah, it's a really great question, because it does seem just completely like supernatural and science fiction sort of madness, or not madness, but exciting kind of wow. But if you think about it, like what it comes down to is the same process that allows us to take one cell from, for example, the udders of a sheep. So some people listening or yourself, you might remember Dolly the sheep, who was cloned from a cell, just one cell from the udder of the female sheep, who was sort of kind of the mother, but also just the same sheep, because Dolly the sheep was exactly the same sheep as the sheep it came from. So from one single cell contains all the DNA, so that's all the genetic information, to make an entire new organism from where it came from. And that single cell, in theory, could be frozen, or even just the DNA in that single cell could be frozen and then used to create that whole organism, in Dolly's case, sheep, again. Now, that's cloning. Now, that's slightly different, because, of course, when you make a baby, you don't clone. It's actually, in a way, it's even simpler, because you're taking an egg cell and you're freezing the DNA, the genetic material in that egg cell, which is basically half of what is going to make a fully adult human one day. And the other half is going to come from the sperm cell. So you're basically just freezing the DNA, but in a sort of protective outer layer, which is the cell itself, like the sort of the nutrients that it's kind of floating around in. And that in itself is like I said with Dolly the sheep, with cloning, it's not dissimilar to, for example, when they find fragments of DNA conserved in, you mentioned freezing a human, but, conserved in ice, and then they extract that DNA and they can use it to clone a creature that was living thousands or millions of years ago. For example, I know that there's some work going on, I think it's in South Korea, to try and clone a woolly mammoth from a bit of woolly mammoth DNA that was found trapped in the ice, I think in Siberia. And, they sort of Jurassic Park was all based on the idea of you cloning a dinosaur based on some dinosaur DNA that was found trapped in amber. I think it was that anyway, or in a mosquito, wasn't it? Trapped in amber, I think it was that. But But all of those, it sort of sounds kind of madness, but actually that's all very possible, because as long as you have the DNA of something, and you can put it in an environment where it can grow and reproduce and make more copies of itself, so you contain it within a cell, ideally, that DNA can then instruct the cell to make another copy of itself with more DNA in it, and then that makes another copy with more DNA in it. And then before you know it, all of those copies end up growing into a fetus, and then into a baby, and then into an adult. But by the time it's a baby, some of those, so every single cell in a baby, just like every single cell in an adult, contains all the DNA necessary to make that baby or that adult again. I mean, that's what a lot of people, I think, don't realize. And for me, that's totally mind-blowing, that in theory, you could take a cell out of your finger and make an entirely new Kelsey. However, the difference, which is why you can't just freeze you and have you come alive in the future, is that once the cells have started to become different to each other, not in terms of their DNA, but in terms of where they are in the body, some genes within the DNA get turned on, whilst other genes, or stay on, other genes actually get switched off. So what that means is that once the body is formed, it's very much dependent on the interactions between all the different cells in the fully formed body. So if you were to freeze a body or even a ball of cells after a certain stage in their development, you wouldn't be able to turn all those processes back on simply by defrosting it. But if you freeze it at an early enough stage in development, or if you find some DNA and you find a way to turn back on all of the genes that have been turned off, you could take it back to that early stage right at day one or day zero of making a whole organism. And if you like, an egg cell is actually day -1, because day zero is when it joins with, or day, or let's say minute or second -1, is when it joins with the sperm DNA and forms a full set of 46 chromosomes, which makes it possible to then grow and develop into a baby and then into a human. So that's a sort of long-winded answer, but I guess the bottom line is that once something has developed past those initial stages, it's very much dependent on all the processes taking place in the body. So you can't just freeze it and sort of start again. But those very early stages, or at the single cell stage of the egg or of an embryo, you can do that, which is why you can also freeze an embryo. So in IVF, and same for egg freeze, in IVF, what they would do is they take out an egg, they would fertilize, like with egg freezing, they will actually stimulate, the woman to produce as many eggs as possible. They would then take out all of those eggs. Usually you get between sort of 10 to 15 is an average harvest, shall we say, for egg freezing and for IVF. And then they would try and fertilize all of those eggs, whether you then freeze them first or whether you do it immediately with IVF. And then you would see how many of those fertilize. And then they will usually implant 2 or possibly 3, if that many do fertilize, like mini embryos. And if there are any extra embryos, those would then be frozen. So you can then freeze an embryo at that very early stage and then defrost it at a later date if that didn't work out, or if they wanted another baby at a later date, and use that embryo. But once it gets past a certain level of development and the cells become so different to each other that they rely on communication between them, then you can't then freeze frame at that point and then defrost later.
Yeah, wow, how fascinating. It's honestly so interesting. So with regards to that, you were saying there's a sort of unfortunately, there's a bit of a sort of ticking clock for women. Like you said, there might be someone that doesn't fall in love until they're in their 40s, but their biological clock is sort of saying, unfortunately, it's harder to get pregnant at this stage. So with that in mind, playing devil's advocate, if you're taking out eggs in your sort of early 30s and then planting them back into yourself and doing all that process in your 40s, if your body naturally stops producing them and is stopping that process of becoming pregnant, couldn't you argue that that's the body's natural way of saying it's no longer capable as an environment to make a baby? Or am I just completely wrong and it's just to do with eggs being made?
It's a really good point, and it's an important point to talk about, because of course it is an argument that's used by a lot of people who are sort of wanting to block this process. So there's a few ways of looking at this. So first of all, in terms of pure biology, there is absolutely no biological reason for a woman's body past fertility age to not have a child growing in it. So there's no, or at least insignificant amounts of kind of decline of the womb or of the parts of the body that are required to actually give birth to the baby. So that's the first important point. Secondly, women evolved to be fertile at pretty much in their entire adult life. Back thousands and millions of years ago, we wouldn't survive past the age of sort of early 40s. That was pretty much the end of life, certainly 50. And it's only thanks to medical advances that we are keeping people alive for longer. Because, pretty much, even if you look back several hundreds of years, the death rates were far, far younger, and the chances of surviving past the age of 45 or 50 was very, very low. So by that same argument, you could say, okay, well, we shouldn't be letting people survive later than 45 or 50. And if we're letting people survive later than 45 or 50, then why not also allow them to have children later than 45 or 50? Because really, women, it's not that there's something changes about a woman's body in terms of that their eggs are no longer healthy. It's just simply that they run out because all of the women's eggs are actually ready, sort of in suspended animation from pretty much in the womb, and they're just ready to mature each month. So it's just simply that the number runs out because we have evolved to have children from the age of about 15 until pretty much death, close to death, and then menopause, and then basically you're just sort of waiting to die, and being a grandparent also ideally to help your children's children. So first of all, as a society, we are maturing in the sense that we are encouraging women to have children later, to not have babies at the age of 14 or 15, for very good reasons in terms of societal framework and expectations and things like that. We're also supporting women to have their own careers, their own professions, although not that that's necessarily different to how it was thousands or millions of years ago, because there's a lot of evidence to show that actually women were just as active in some ways in tribal culture in sort of terms of hunting and gathering and all of that. But also in tribal cultures, there was a lot more village community. There was a lot more ability for women to have babies and to go out and work at the same time, whereas our sort of increasingly isolated kind of singular 2.4 nuclear family culture means that it is actually a lot harder for women to have children and to carry out their role in the world, in society, their birthright, as well as having children, because they have to stay home often and look after those children rather than have communities and villages who can take it in turns. So I think for all of these reasons, the argument of like, well, that's when women are supposed to stop having babies is just gets totally blown out of the water, because it's like saying, well, you've got cancer, you should die. It's like, well, the point of medical advances is that we use it to help people to have chemotherapy or to have different treatments. To if you've got diabetes, well, you just can't produce enough insulin, you should just get really sick and die from that. It's like, no, we've invented ways to inject insulin so that people with diabetes can live relatively normal lives, and people with cancer can often be completely cured in remission through chemotherapy. So the argument that like, oh well, we're playing with nature or interfering with natural cycles, to me is just complete nonsense. And this idea that women should be having children earlier is also nonsense in a society that has matured to support and allow women to have careers, to have their passions in the world other than having children, and also actually actively prevents women from being able to be as able to work and have children as it should do, by not living in communities and by not living in a society in which, by living in a society in which women are sort of encouraged to have do it all, and to have to sort of do the childcare and go to work, or do one or the other, which none of that is, I believe, and certainly a lot of anthropologists believe, is how we're programmed to live.
Yeah, and finally, just on this subject, from the other person's perspective with regards to egg freezing, how do you think partners feel about this? You mentioned sort of like dating and stuff, and not wanting to sit there and go, work out if you're the correct partner. And whilst egg freezing eliminates that kind of rush, it must be kind of hard to discuss with someone new, or or even when it comes down to it, because I think whilst it shows tremendous foresight on the woman's part and very responsibly, you can't help but notice it eliminates a certain level of the sort of romance with conception. Maybe a partner going, I want to make a baby, and the other person's there going, right, grab your coat, we're off to the lab for some time with a jar. That kind of thing.
Yep, I hear what you're saying. And again, I think there's some important points to raise around this. So first of all, in saying that, by definition, you're very much talking in a heteronormative model. So there's a lot of couples who actually don't have access within the couple to eggs and sperm, so would have to have that conversation anyway. So for example, my partner is non-binary and assigned female at birth. So in the past, I've had mainly heterosexual cis male partners. My partner identifies as male. Actually, he uses the pronouns he, him. His name's Kimway, but he's assigned female at birth and is in a female body, so doesn't have any sperm. So for us, if we wanted to have a child together, that would be our child, we would have to have that conversation anyway. So one important point here is that we're, by saying, oh, it takes the romance out of it, we've got to realize that there's a lot of people out there who are in relationships where that conversation needs to be had anyway, whether it's, oh, let's get you pregnant by, a nice male friend who can do the job, or whether it's let's go and get those eggs in the laboratory, one way or another. So that's firstly important. But secondly, talk about taking the romance out of things. There's it's very hard if you're a woman in their late 30s. There's no romance whatsoever if men are sort of saying, oh, well, I'm not going to date you because I want to have a child, and the chances are it's going to be harder, or if not impossible, to have a child with you if we leave it too long. Or if you're in your early 40s, I want to have a child with this woman, but I'm not going to date her because she might not be able to have one at all. So in terms of the romance, I've been on dating sites where I've been encouraged by friends to lie about my age because without explaining it on my dating profile, any cis male, biologically male men who wanted to have a natural child wouldn't even consider me over the age of 35. And, so like it or not, we are faced with the fact that romance to some extent needs to be out of the picture when it comes to having a baby, because what's romantic about having a baby anyway, to be quite honest? It's a decision that should be well thought through, and also a practical decision. Yes, of course, emotional, and yes, of course, it comes out of love. But the actual act itself, of course, to some extent, there might be a fantasy that you just sort of leave it to nature and you just see what happens, and you go on a romantic dinner, and then next month you have a baby. But often it doesn't work like that. The rate of miscarriage is far higher than a lot of people talk about. There's a lot of heartache that comes around the getting pregnant whole business of things, and a lot of women do end up having miscarriages, being shamed into not talking about it. It's very common, and actually it does come down to often monitoring your cycle, working out when you're most fertile. There's no romance around that anyway. So I think actually I think we need to dispel this idea that having a baby should be a romantic sort of, oh, it happens when it happens thing. It can be, and that's wonderful, but then also you can end up having a child when you don't actually want one, because that can also be used as an excuse to not use a condom by a cis male. It's like, oh, well, let's just see if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. And maybe the woman doesn't actually want to have a baby quite yet, and maybe they feel pressured into not using a condom because it ruins the romance. So I think it's a valid point, but in itself is kind of flawed. And I think there can be a lot of romance around having those conversations, and there's certainly been a lot of romance with myself and my partner around talking about, are we going to use my frozen eggs, and if so, how would we do that, and how can we ritualize that, and how can we make that just as magical as it would be as if I had naturally kept them inside me, which they would be certainly not fertile by now, but if we was doing it 5 years ago, and if he had the natural sperm to be able to do that with me.
Totally. Well, thank you so much for sort of explaining all of this to me and sort of enlightening me on an area of life I had no idea was, like I said, it's just when I was doing my research about you, and you, like you said, you speak very openly about it, I was like, hang on, is this a thing? I just find it so interesting, and it's just such a good indicator of how far science has come and the things that we're able to do, and how lucky we are in 2020 to be able to do things that we couldn't do 20, 30, 40 years ago. Just before we go, I would love for you to quickly just mention the books that you've written. You do a lot of stuff for schools and kids' books and stuff like that. And I think science is extremely important for young people to know. Yes, by the way, this is a religious person saying science is important, just to debunk that stereotype. I still believe in science.
I'm religious too.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
What religion are you?
I'm Jewish, and I'm very spiritually Jewish in the sense that I'm not that religious in the sense of a lot of the sort of keeping of customs and rituals, but I'm very spiritually Jewish in the sense of beliefs and my connection to my past and to the Jewish people and to a lot of the mystical side of things, and I observe a couple of the Jewish festivals, and it's very important to me.
Yeah, how great! It's almost we've done a full circle. It's come back to that thing of not assuming that you can't be an actor, a dancer, a scientist, and religious. So how good? What nice bow we've tied on this episode. Where can we find your books, and where can we find out about them?
Great. Yeah, thank you for asking that. So you can find out generally more about me and my work, and particularly my work around climate activism, which is a big part of what I do these days, through my website, which is just my name, emilygrossman.co.uk. You can also follow me on Twitter, which is at Dr Emily Grossman, Grossman spelled Gross for sugar, MAN, or on Instagram at Dr Emily Grossman 1. In terms of my books, so the my baby, shall we call it, is a book called Brain Fizzing Facts: Awesome Science Questions Answered, and that came out September 2019 in the UK, and it's just come out, so November 2020 in the United States, under a different title of What Breathes Through Its Butt. I think it's called What Breathes Through Its Butt. It's one of the questions in the book. And it's a book of kind of weird science facts. It's multiple choice questions, but with long, quirky explanations of the facts. It's super fun. It's done really well. It's been sort of best-selling here in the UK, and it's already got some great reviews out in the States as well. And it was shortlisted for the Teach Primary Book Awards here in the UK. So that's done really well. I'm really proud of it. I'm really excited about the sort of reception that it's had here. And the other thing that I've been working on and writing over the last few years is to do with my climate activism, which is an online guide to the climate and ecological crisis, which I wrote together with, it's free, it's very easy to read. That's what we wanted to do, because I wrote it with the support of an amazing group of scientists called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. So myself and some other scientists founded the Scientists for Extinction Rebellion community about a year ago, October 2019. And one of the things that we've done together, and calling on a wide range of experts from all sorts of different fields to fact check and endorse this big online sort of book, essentially, that we've written, is to get the truth out to the public. So this guide is called Emergency on Planet Earth. You can find it in several places. You can find it on the Extinction Rebellion UK website. So if you go to Extinction Rebellion UK website and you follow the links for the emergency and then the truth, it's also available as a free online Google document. So you don't have to go through the Extinction Rebellion website. It's free to download, free to print it. You can read it offline, and you can find that through the Extinction Rebellion page that I just mentioned, or you can Google just my name, Dr. Emily Grossman, and Emergency on Planet Earth, and it should come up. And if all else fails, it's linked to on my website, which is emilygrossman.co.uk. And finally, and I really would encourage everybody to read that. It's very easy to access in terms of sort of for non-scientists. It's very easy to absorb. Please do read it, and please do share it on all your networks with all your communities. And it's for teenagers and adults. And it's really important that everyone finds out the truth about what's going on the planet, and most crucially, what we can do to help. And finally, using the information that I learned on that sort of deep dive of finding out about what's going on the planet and how to explain it, I decided to focus my second kids book. So that's the follow-up to Brain Fizzing Facts, which is going to be out in May 2021 in the UK. But you'll be able to order it if you're in a different country. You can order it online from the UK. So I decided to write that follow-up, which is going to be called World Whizzing Facts: Awesome Earth Questions Answered. And I decided to focus in that book a lot on what's going on the planet, climate change, wildlife loss, and what we can all do to help. But also thrown in for good fun, lots of other facts on wee and poo, which is, I know, what a lot of the kids like. So both of those books are aimed at kids aged 7+, but I'm reliably informed that Brain Fizzing Facts is very much enjoyed by older teenagers and lots of grown-ups too. And in fact, one of the reviews said it was the ideal toilet book to have in your toilet for those longer stays. So World Whizzing Facts, which is out in May, but available for pre-order now through online bookstores. That is a similar format, really fun facts, really quirky, really silly, very much my sense of humour, but with also lots of information about what we're doing to our planet, but also lots of hope about all of the projects that are going on that are really helping the planet, protecting the planet, and what you as children or as grown-ups can also do to help.
Well, there you go. I definitely urge people to go and seek out those books. Also, just look up everything that you've done, because I found it so interesting. You're very inspirational in all the work that you do and the campaigning. So definitely go check her out. And thank you so much, Dr. Emily, for joining me today. I've stuck with Dr. Emily. It just feels right. It just came out naturally then. I didn't even think about it. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me, and thanks for calling me Dr. Emily. It always makes me giggle. So thank you, and thanks to everyone who's listened. And feel free to reach out, get in touch, or to chat to me on social media. Anyone who's listening, feel free to sort of, and if you want me to come along and speak at an event, obviously mostly online these days, or to kids or to adults, or you're interested in finding out more about how I can support the work that you do, or how that I can bring kind of climate change awareness or fun facts awareness to the work that you do or to the networks that you move in, then please do get in touch.
Thanks, Dr. Emily. So that was Dr. Emily Grossman. What a fascinating chat that was. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favourite podcast player. That way, you'll never miss an episode as soon as it comes out. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to get first notice of future guests and the chance to send in your questions before the next recording. Just search for Kelsey De Almeida on those sites. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by becoming a Patreon member by going to patreon.com/anti-skeptic, where you can send me a monthly donation to help support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.